I have to ask you, first of all, given the developments with the coronavirus, I'm curious what the impact is of that on the already tense relationship between the U.S. and China from a security perspective.
Thanks, Emily, for having me. I think, with respect to that issue, I mean, despite our many differences, obviously that's an issue that we have a lot in common in terms of pulling in the same direction and trying to have that virus be contained. So it hasn't really, to my knowledge, impacted our security relationship at this point, but we'll wait and see.
So how would you describe the state of the U.S.-China relationship in cyberspace today?
Well, in cyberspace, it's still a challenge. I mean, we continue to see acts of thefts of sensitive personal data. The Equifax credit breach was the one that we most recently announced, but that builds on hacks of Office of Personnel Management records. All of us who have security clearances. It builds on hacks of Anthem, of Marriott. So it's a ongoing effort by the Chinese to take vast quantities of sensitive personal data of Americans and to use them both to develop artificial intelligence tools, but also to develop, from an intelligence perspective, targeting packages of individuals or profiles of individuals in whom they have an interest.
Yes, John, in terms of the Equifax hack, I mean, you mentioned concerns for consumers there, but are those overshadowed by those national security concerns you described?
I think when you have a nation-state hack, the concerns are less for consumers because it's very unusual for a nation-state to use it and, to open up a credit card with your information and charge a new card to it. The threat is really more from a national security perspective, especially with respect to those individuals in whom the Chinese intelligence services or the Chinese military has a particular interest.
So do you feel the United States has enough resources available to counter these sorts of hacks?
Yes, although this is not just a U.S. government resource question, because a lot of the hacks obviously are of the private sector where that data is held. And that's something where we have seen a lot of focus obviously in the private sector on cybersecurity and a lot of resources placed in cybersecurity and a lot more collaboration between the private and public sectors. And that's what it's going to need moving forward because it's a constantly evolving threat, and the defenses to the threat have to evolve with the threat itself as the Chinese actors get more sophisticated, both in the hacks and then in trying to hide their tracks.
So let's talk a little bit about Huawei. The U.S. decided to add charges against Huawei recently, allegations of racketeering. Why add those charges in a case that's already going to be difficult to prove?
So I think what the allegations are meant to get at is that the theft of intellectual property by Huawei, and those are all the acts that underlie the racketeering charge of theft of intellectual property, that is, according to the indictment, part of the way in which they do business. These aren't one-off events where maybe you have a rogue employee who does something and, or the company does something wrong once. This is a way that they have done business. It's a way that they have gotten their intellectual property, and it's a way that they've then helped to fund their research and development by monetizing that intellectual property.
Now, in some ways, you could say that other governments haven't taken Huawei as much of a threat as the U.S. seems to believe that Huawei is. How much progress do you think the U.S. is making on convincing other countries of its position? Yeah,
well, that's an ongoing effort for us. Obviously, there are countries who have taken the same position as we have, whether it's Australia, Japan, and others. But there are other countries like the UK that have decided that they can mitigate that threat while having the equipment on their networks. It's something we disagree with, and it's something we'll continue to work with like-minded countries around the world in order to try to demonstrate that threat to them and how difficult it is to mitigate it once you allow the equipment on the networks.
Is there a case of a double-edged sword here? Is there a risk that if you pursue legally some Chinese scientists, you might actually end up deterring some of China's best and brightest coming to the U.S.?
Well, we want to be clear that we are open for collaboration. We're open for students to come here. We're open for researchers, for employees of various companies to come here. But when they come here, they need to act above board, right? They can't come here pretending to be one thing and then in fact being something else. They can't come here pretending to work at one school and then going to another school or a different lab at the same school. So it's a balance, obviously, that we have to strike here. But our message is, our universities remain open, our businesses remain open, but when we come here, we expect you to act openly and honestly.